part 3 of LA Fishguys, the 280-gallon tank in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We're ready to start putting the salt into the system. We just got it running tonight. We added enough water, purified, reverse osmosis, deionized water in the system. So it's a great foundation water quality-wise. We've got the system up and running. It's a 2-pump system. One, the filter pump that circulates water from the filter back to the tank and down to the filter. 2, the internal circulation pump, which is the pump that draws straight from the tank and returns directly to the tank, allowing us to have a very heavy flow of water, 3,600 gallons an hour, as a matter of fact. And that flow is attached to 2 oscillating discharge nozzles, so we've got a very random and chaotic, always changing current within the tank. And the hope and expectation on my part is all that flow moving around is going to sweep or at least keep loose debris from settling in the system. No place to hide, for lack of a better description. And while they're suspended, they'll eventually go out through the internal overflow down into the Berlin filter, where they might get trapped out with those micron socks. As I mentioned, we're ready to add the salt now. These are buckets that make 150 gallons each. So we're going to end up adding just a little bit less than 2 of these buckets to the system. And my whole point of wanting to get the system running tonight, Friday night, of which as a matter of fact, it's actually Saturday morning, it's now 12:30, but my whole reason for wanting to get the salt into the tank tonight is so that it has all night long to dissolve. That way we can kind of get ahead of the game tomorrow as far as adding all that fancy live rock. So let's get putting this salt into the system. Inside these 5-gallon buckets is the salt mix. As I've said before, making salt water is actually easier than baking a cake. Everything's already pre-mixed for you. You just simply add enough salt to raise the density or the salinity of the water to a certain point. Each one of these buckets, by the way, when I take the salt out of here, I've got good water change buckets to use afterwards as well. Each one of these buckets makes 150 gallons of salt water. We've got a 280-gallon tank plus a sump. I think it would be best to not put all the salt in, just a little bit shy, because I think it's easier to add a few handfuls of salt later on to raise the salinity than it would be to have to siphon salt water out of the tank and add fresh water back to dilute it. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this 5-gallon bucket now, and we're going to take and pour the contents of it directly into the tank and get that salt water or salt mix dissolving to become salt water. And as you can see, that kind of looks like table salt. But it's actually all the elements needed to mimic real salt water. Something like 5 major elements, a dozen significant trace elements, and about 70 minor or trace elements. We're going to go ahead and just lift that up and pour it into the tank.
Those 7 major elements are sodium chloride, magnesium sulfate, calcium sulfate, potassium sulfate, calcium carbonate, and potassium or sodium bromide. What's interesting is this ratio is always the same all around the world. And as I said, there are about 70 minor or trace elements, and these can be broken into 2 different groups, organic and inorganic. The inorganic could be things such as sulfur, lead, silver, zinc, copper, iodine, aluminum, iron, or silver. And the organic versions could be vitamins, pigments, plant hormones, or orthophosphates and such. And the beauty for today's marine aquarist is the manufacturers have already pre-mixed all of these things in the right solutions or ratios for you.
So that's the conclusion of day number 1, or should I say night number 1, because it's a 1:45 in the morning. But I've got the system running, it's full of water, we've added the salt mix, it's dissolving, we've got one tiny little leak. I feel good about it. So I'm gonna go get some shut-eye. We'll be back again tomorrow morning and we'll see how our system's doing, and then we'll start adding some live rock.
Those clouds break for you, Jim, and get the grand in there.
I'm just trying to take some pictures now while there's no clouds up there.
Yeah, that's called the pyramid.
That pointy one right there?
Mm-hmm.
And then you say the big tall one's over here somewhere?
Yeah, it's behind the clouds.
It's the following day on our big Wyoming reef tank. We've got the hydrometer here ready to test and see what the salinity is. This is a simple needle hydrometer. 1020 on my first attempt, which is good. Again, this is a simple needle hydrometer. There's all fancy floating glass hydrometers as well as the refractometer. For me, this is the simplest. May not be the most accurate, but this is the simplest. Takes 5 seconds to test the salt level. Doesn't have to spend a bunch of time calibrating or making some electronic instrument work. This is simple. So now that we've got the salt level stabilized, we're going to go ahead and start putting in the live rock. We discussed briefly what we're looking for as far as a foundation or a framework, and we're going to slowly build that into what it is we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to go ahead and start separating the rock over there, and then we'll bring it over pieces at a time, starting obviously with the bottom, and then build it up. Okay, so here's all the live rock, and to get an idea as to what we have to work with, it's already kind of sorted, but I think I want to go through and sort it a little bit more specific so we know what pieces to bring. It just gives me an idea as to how best to build it and what I have to work with. So we're going to go ahead and start kind of sorting some of this rock, and then we'll carry it over to the tank in 5-gallon buckets at a time, and obviously introduce a piece at a time to build our coral reef foundation.
And with my trusty assistants eager to lend a hand, we're going to go through and begin to sort the rock. We can break it out into flat pieces, branching pieces, big pieces, small pieces, as well as separating the rubble or the really small stuff. We'll load these larger pieces here in the beginning in the buckets, and we'll carry them over to the tank where I'll begin to put them in one piece at a time, slowly building based on my interpretation of what they've described, what I will call the reef foundation. This is not the final work of art. It gets close. It's the backbone or the foundation that the corals will be placed upon. So it takes a little bit of thinking and a little bit of envisionment as well.
Okay, if you remember right, there's that strainer back inside there that is the suction for the circulation pump. We want to hide it, but at the same time, we want to gain access to it down the road, because that strainer is designed to strain out the big particles that don't get sucked into the pump. So that means there's going to be particles that are going to attach to it or get sucked into it. So we have to make it accessible so we can get in there and loosen that strainer basket and take it off at some point down the road. So we're kind of building a little bit of a cave around it, and then there'll be a decorative rock that'll be placed in the opening, and that decorative rock will hide it, and yet at the same time allow us to remove that rock, reach down in there, loosen that strainer, of which just a little bit ago you saw me with the wrench in there, pre-loosening it because I didn't want to have to try to figure out how to loosen it underwater when I have to gain access to it. This way it's semi-loose and should just unscrew by hand. So now that we've added a whole bunch of rock into the system, the filter has risen up, or the water level has risen up, so we need to take some of that water out before we can add any more of the live rock to the tank.
And as I mentioned in the previous part, if you're going to be a saltwater hobbyist, you're going to have to learn to create a siphon or use a siphon hose. So be sure to come on back for the next part, part 4, as we finish adding the live rock, that 500 pounds of Indonesian live rock, to this 280-gallon, going to be coral reef tank.
Oh, really?